Hello! So I was looking at some bouncy ball stuff, so I thought it'd be cool just to show, just put it up there, and why not? If you're like, bouncy ball, nah, not for me. Watch anyway, because there might be some things in here that I use that, you didn't know about, maybe, so it could all help. But anyway, bouncy balls, yeah? Alright, so we've got this ball mesh. Over here you can see radius is 18 centimeters. The bloody dog won't shut up again. So, I have seen a few tutorials online, and they did a method using bones. So if they went in here and they click on bones, you can draw a bone up like that, go to bone tools, and you can turn off the freeze length and set it to squash. So now if you skin this mesh to the bone, like this, we get this nice little squash and stretch happening. And that's okay, that's pretty cool, but the only thing is, if we start stretching it to the side like this, you see it moves the whole ball, so the actual ball rotation moves with the stretch. So this is going to be a nightmare to animate. It's pretty much, you can't animate like this because we can't separate the rotation from the skin. So if we start rotating the ball now, you see it rotates the whole ball. We can't actually rotate the ball. So what we could do, so we're going to modifier stack. We can go down until we find something called, where the bloody freaking there it is, stretch. So we can use a stretch modifier. And now if we adjust this, you can see it squash and stretches the ball, which is pretty cool. But you notice it's sort of, as we start to stretch it up too high like this, so we go here, you see it, as we start to stretch it right up, it starts to sort of squeeze in on itself. So you see how our first initial stretch it just doesn't look right, it just looks weird. And if we go too far down like this, you see how it sort of looks, it gives it like a UFO sort of saucer looking look to it. I don't know, it just doesn't look right. See there, it's like more like a diamond. But I mean, you can use that if you want, if you like the effect of this. Let's say you want to stretch from the bottom, so let's say we move the gizmo down, the center of it, so move the center down to the bottom. Now you can see we've got this weird sort of thing happening. So, we can sort of, if we want to try and rotate, this gizmo, it still moves with the, what am I doing? So now it just doesn't look right. It's just I don't know. So what we can do is we can use an FFD modifier. So if we're going to modify a stack, we can go down to FFD, we can choose box, and now what we can do is we can select these control points and we can just move these and it will deform the mesh. Well, we've got too many points, so we can go to set number of points and we can just change them all to default to 2. And now if we select these control points, we can just do something, we can move it like this. So now what we can do is we can select all the control points, we can use our scale deformer like this, and we can pretty much get a nice squash and stretch of how we want the ball to, squash and stretch, pretty much. Because the FFD box is a modifier added on top of the sphere, it just moves with the sphere. So we get the same problem we had before, where our squash and stretch is just gonna, it doesn't allow us to angle the squash and stretch independently of the ball's rotation. So what we can do is, instead of using a object-based modifier, we can use a world-space one. So we can go into our space warps, and you see here we've got our deformable space warps. So we've actually got FFD box in there. So we can drag an FFD box out, and we can do the same thing. So we can go number of points, set it to default to 2, go OK, and now what we can do is we can set it to the same, it's pretty much to match our ball. So we know our ball is 18 centimeters radius, so we can just give our, what is it, double that, it's what, 36 I think, so 36, 36, 36. So now this ball, this FFD Space Warp should match our ball size. So now what we can do is we can just align it to our ball. Yep. So what we can do now is we can go into our, we can bind this sphere, this ball mesh to the Space Warp by using our Bind to Space Warp button here. We can just drag that to the Space Warp. So now if we go into our FFD box, we can grab the control points and we can scale them a certain way, so like this. But now what we can do is we can also, because the FFD box exists on its own out in the world, we can then scale, we can rotate this now, and notice how the ball's rotation is actually staying exactly the same as it was. And then I can also go into the ball and I can start rotating the ball. So I can rotate the ball independently of that squash and stretch. But we've got an issue because we want to control these points. So we can go in and we can go and select these points and we can scale them manually if we want. That's great. But if we just try to scale the box itself, so now I'm scaling the box itself, see how the FFD box it scales, but it doesn't actually deform. So what we can do is all these individual control points here, we can wire these up to scale, to move in a certain way. So what we'll do is we'll create a reference object that we can use to control these points. So if I go to this one, point, let's create a point. We'll just click there and let's just set it to the origin, so it's in the middle of the scene. So now we'll use this point as a reference for how we want to move these control points. So we'll go into animation, go to parameter wiring dialog. Now we'll just refresh this with our point selected. And now if we expand that a little bit, we can go down to where it says scale. So you notice that scale, it doesn't actually have X, Y, Z. So what we'll do is we'll quickly go into our controller, click on scale, and we'll change that to a scale X, Y, Z control. So now we've got all three axes. So we've got X, Y, Z axes to work with. And now what we'll do is we'll say that we'll expand this one on the other side so that we get our scale values again. And we'll say what we want to do is we want to say when Z, we want that to control X. So now, if I was to wire this up, connect, bang. Now, if I scale Z axis, it's also going to scale the X axis. So now, if I was to link my ball to this point controller, boom. Now, if I animate scale Z, you can see that the X is also scaling up. The Y is not, so the Y is staying the same scale, but the X is scaling up, in relation to the Z. So what we want to do is we actually want to give this a little bit of a formula to keep its volume, which is if we take Z scale, but what we'll do is we'll do 1 divided by square root, and we'll put Z scale in these little parentheses or whatever the fuck they're called. Go update, bang, and now what happens is the x-axis, see, it will scale. It'll try and keep its volume as it scales, like that. So now what we can do is, because we only want to use this square root value once. We don't want to calculate square root all the time. Because we know that our x-axis is going to scale the way we want it, we can just use our x-axis to control the y scale as well. So we can go there, connect, bang. So now when we do our scale Z, you can see that we get our proper scaling happening here. Now we've got the values we need to help out our little points over here. So I can just unlink the ball. For now, I'll just unlink that to break the connection. So if I want to link these points up, I have to obviously, so for starters, I have to get my first object, which is the point, because that's what's going to be controlling our points. And then secondly, I have to click our FFD box and refresh that, so we can expand our FFD, go into our object points. And you can see here we've got our master point controls down here, but we can't actually see the points. So we can't actually control them yet. We don't know. There's no way of wiring them up. So in order to do that, we have to actually make them animatable. So what we can do is we can just quickly go to our control points, select them all, press K to set a key down here, and then we can just delete that key if you want. But you'll see up here now, because we set a key, now they're expandable. So I can see all the points now. So we can control all these different points in the FFD box. And if I was just to quickly hide, say, let's hide these shapes. So the way it works is this is our front left point here, and this is actually our first point, and its coordinates, they're actually not in relation to the world. The coordinates are actually in relation to itself. So the FFD box has its own coordinates for these points. And what it pretty much does is this bottom left is actually 0, 0, 0. And this top right up here is 1, 1, 1. So what that means is directly in between these, so the origin is actually 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. So it sort of says that everything within these bounds is just from 0 to 1. So it doesn't actually have values in the world. So up here is probably something like, obviously this is 36 in real world units, but according to this box, it's actually 1. Like it's 1 high because 1 is its limit, is its boundary. So it's always from 0 to 1. So if we, so we can offset that. So we can grab a point and we can start to move this over way to the side like that. So we can go further than 1. And we can also move it in and go less than 1, so we can start to go back towards 0. And we can also go negative, so we can grab, say, this little point down here and put it into negative. So now it's negative. It'll go down to, like, say, -1, and that's how it deforms things. So one thing you have to keep in mind is that it creates these points in a certain order. So it'll start down here in the bottom left, then it will go straight across to the right, which is point 2. So it starts at point 1, goes to point 2, and then what it does is it makes this little diagonal jolt over here, goes to point 3, and it goes over here to point, oh, bloody dogs. Then it goes over here to point 4, and then what it does is when it goes up again, it basically starts that order again. So it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, and it goes 5, 6, 7, 8. So that's our order of points. And in terms of the numbers, so from 0 to 1, this one down here, like I said, is 0, 0, 0, and this one up here is 1, 1, 1. So this one over here has obviously, it's Z, so Z is the last axis, so X, Y, Z. So Z is obviously still on the ground, so Z is still 0. But X axis, it's moved over, so it's gone from 0 to 1. But on the Y, it stayed on the same Y axis. So it's actually, so this one is actually 1, 0, 0. And then this point here is 0, 1, 0. And obviously this one up here will be the same, so it'll be 0, 1, 0, but because it's moved up on the Z axis, it's actually, 0, 0, 1, 1. So hopefully that makes a bit more sense. Ugh. It's making me go cross-eyed a little bit. What we want to do is, we're going to take the scale values from our point, so I get the point back. I'll get the, let's get the parameter wiring dialog up again. So now I'll just get the, so let's get the point here, yep, and the FFD box on the other side, refresh that. Now that we've set up our scale and our reference object, we can simply go over to our FFD and we can say, let's control these points. So a good example here is, let's say this control point over here, so remember this is point 8, and this is, its coordinate system within itself is 1, 1, 1. So therefore, if we lined up our scale to point 8, and we just did a direct connection, so if I go connect, connect, we know that now, sorry, bloody dog won't stop barking. So now we know that because it's all the values are 1, 1, 1, and we know that this scale values is going to be 1, 1, 1, we know that now if we were to animate our scale on the Z-axis, this 1, 1, 1 value is going to work exactly how we want it. See, it's actually scaling the ball. And the good thing about this is that we're not actually scaling the FFD box, we're actually just scaling control points. So we can scale it, so we can skew it like this. Now we can select the FFD box, and we can simply rotate this, and it's going to keep its control point offset. So we're going to keep rotating around the ball and deforming the ball, but the ball's going to remain upright. So now we can still do it. So we can offset, say, look, we can put the scale rotated all the way over this way, and we can still scale this controller, and it's still going to keep its offset based on the direction of the FFD box. But there's one issue. So the scale here, the values are 1, 1, 1. So the direct scale is going to work exactly as planned with point 8. However, this point here, point 1, remember that the coordinates for that one is 0, 0, 0. So what happens if we just wire that up? So if I go scale to point 1 and I just do a direct connection, connect, bang, you see it shits itself. So it pretty much goes over. It's telling this point to go from 0, 0, 0 to go to 1, 1, 1. So it's sharing the same coordinates now as the other one. So it's just going to do the same thing. You know, because it needs to be a 0, but it's setting it to 1. So we need to subtract 1 from that value so it goes back to 0. So what we can do is, instead of just using a direct connection using the scale values, we can actually separate that out. So we can separate that out into a vector. So if we do these two brackets and then we do, say, something like, 0, 0, 0, obviously if we do update, that's just going to put it back to 0, 0, 0. But it's not going to do anything because it's just staying at 0, 0, 0. So what we want to do is we want to take the scale, the XYZ scale, and separate that into little things. So we can separate, say scale dot x is the first one because that's where x needs to be. The next one's obviously going to be scale dot y. Type in scale dot z for the last one. If I go update, it's going to do exactly the same thing. So it's basically just separating these values out so we can work with them now. So now, if I was to, we want to set these back to 0. So what I'll do is I'll go, I'll do 1. So the value is 1 minus scale. So now it's setting it back to 0. And if I go 1 minus again, and then 1 minus again, do update. And now, what's happening is if we do the scale, you can see that we're pretty much getting the opposite. So we're getting the where everything's scaling exactly how we want it. So pretty much, as a rule of thumb, what we can do now is we can go through and we can do a direct connection, but we can actually separate these values so we can actually see all the values we need. And for every value that needs to be a one-to-one connection, we can keep the scale values exactly how they are. But for everyone that's 0, we can just put 1 negative in front of it. So we can do an example, say, let's do point 2. Go to point 2, and then what we can do is we can do the same thing. So I can type in scale.x, then scale.y, then scale.z. Typed the wrong thing there for some reason. So now this one is for point 2, but because we know point 2, the coordinates is 1, 0, 0. What that means is because x is 1, we can leave scale exactly 1, scale as it is, because that's a one-to-one connection, but the rest are 0, 0. So what we can do is we can do 1 minus, then 1 minus. Then we can go do that and go connect. Now it should work. There we go. So now it's working exactly how we want it to work. So pretty much what we can do now is we can go through, we can pretty much just say, let's copy this, copy, and we can go through each point. So we can go to, say, point 3, so we can click on that. And go connect. So now, when I scale it, see our sphere sort of does what we want, but what we want to do is we actually want to scale it. When we scale it, we want to scale it around the bottom. For all our points that are on the ground, we can keep the z coordinates at 0. So if we go back to point 1, see how our z, it's set to minus scale z. If we just set that to 0, now update it, it's going to stay at 0. So if we do that for all the rest of the points on the ground, 0, update. Now what's going to happen is we scale it, you see it's going to scale and squash and stretch, and it's going to keep its origin point on the ground. We don't want to have to click on this little point all the time, so go in here and find something called 0.001, which we should probably rename it. So let's call it, oh, I can't type today. Boo! Reference. Oh, Jesus, come on. Boom, there we go. Point scale reference. I'll hide these. You can see I've got this whole bunch of different shapes that I made. And they're just using lines, so you can go and make your own, make them look however you want. But I've just pre-made them so I don't spend too much time yapping. But pretty much what we can do is we can use these shapes to guide our ball. So I'm going to use this little circle here. I'm going to use this as our squash and stretch controller. So if I hide everything else and I just align this to the ball, so there we go, now it's in the middle. Make sure everything's ticked, yep, go OK. Now what I can do is I can firstly rename this to something like ball squash. So if I hide the FFD box now, because we don't need that, we don't need to see it. Now I can go into the squash and stretch, the ball squash controller. I can add a modifier called attribute holder, and now we can add all these controls to this menu if we want. So I can go into the animation menu, go to parameter editor, and this is where we get to add our controllers. So I can make sure that this is set to current modifier, go down, make sure it's float so we get decimal points. We can give this, we can give it a slider. Let's give it a slider, and we'll call it squash. Squash. Whoops. Squash. There we go. And what we'll do is we'll do a range. So we'll do. We want it to go. So when we go down to 0, it's going to be pretty much squashed as much as it can. But the problem is if we keep it at 0, that means we can get to 0. And if we can get to 0, it means it's going to start shitting itself because it's going to just go all over the place. So just type in like 0.01 or something, just so you can never actually get to 0, so it doesn't go mental. And we know that our scale, when we scale it up, our scale value is going to be like 1. So let's pick like a maximum of how high you want the scale to go. So let's just do like say 3 or something, and we'll default it to 1 because we want it to stay at 1 because that's going to be our value. So 1's going to be no stretch and no squash. If we go below 1, it's going to be squashing. If we go above 1, it's going to be stretching. So now this is what it looks like. So it looks pretty good. So we'll just go to add. So now I've got our little controller over here. And we'll go to wiring parameter wiring dialog. So we want to click refresh so we get our squash controller on this side, and then we want to click our point and refresh so we get it on this side. So now we just expand our ball squash until we find our attribute holder, custom attributes, and our squash. So this is the controller over here we just added, squash controller, and we want this to affect our scale Z. So if I go in here, now what we can do is I can just go one side, I can go direct wiring, so I can do this squash will affect the scale, click that and go connect, and now it's wired up so that if I go into this controller here, if I adjust the squash, see it's gonna affect the point scale. So what we can do now is we want to angle it. So remember how I said before, so if I get the FFD box out, remember how I said before, so if I do a squash, I can select the FFD box and we can angle it a certain direction, so over here. Well, that's great, but we don't want to have to go in and select the FFD box every time. So what we can do is we can simply just link the FFD box to our squash controller. Boom! So now if I hide the FFD box and I use the squash controller, this now is solely just for squashing and stretching. So I can squash it this way and then I can rotate it, say, over this way, and now we can pretty much angle our squash and stretch any way we want. So now what we can do is we can set up all our other controllers, which is pretty straightforward. So unhide these other shapes, so bang, bang, and you'll notice that this one here is sort of like a move tool. So what we're going to use this for, we're going to use this to move the ball around. So we'll call this ball pos for position. So that'll be just for position, and this little angular one, arrow one I've got here, we'll call this ball rot for rotation. And now what we can do is we can pretty much just align this some way. So we can say, let's bring it up like that, let's put it there, stuff around 90 degrees, maybe like that. I want to make the ball rotate with this rotation controller. So if I was to just directly link the ball to it now, so let's try that. If I just link that ball now what happens is if I rotate the controller, it's going to rotate around the wrong axis. So I want to just undo that and make sure that I set this this controller here, its pivot point, to the direct center of this ball. So the way we can do that is we can go into pivot, we can go effect pivot only. Now we can do align tool and click on our ball, and now what it's going to do, we set the X position to our pivot. Actually, let's do orientation as well. So we want to keep the same orientation. And now we can do OK, bang. So if I link the ball back up to this controller, now what's going to happen is it's going to rotate the ball, which is what we want. So what we can do now is we can link both of these, so this one and this one, we can link those to the move controller because we know that the ball is linked to this rotation controller here. So if I link this rotation controller to the move controller, it's going to move it. So now it's all going to move together. We can also do this little reference point there. We can keep that linked to that as well. That remember we're only using that as reference. So I'll link that to that move controller, and then now we've got our main sort of rig done. Firstly, let's freeze the transformation. So we can select all these main controllers that we want. We can hold Alt, go up to freeze transform, click yes, and now it's told us that that's our main. This is where they belong. So now if I was to go, move this, say over here somewhere, if I was to, rotate this over this way, if I was to, then rotate this that way, now what I can do is if I select all these controllers, so this one, this one, and this one, if I hold Alt and go transform to 0, there you go. So all they've all been reset pretty much. Another thing we can do as well is we pretty much don't want the animator to start, tweaking things. So we can hide this point scale reference because we don't need that, see that anymore. And we can start locking transforms. So let's say for our move, all we want to do is move it around. So we can go up to here. Where is it? To our link info. Go to link info, and we can say we've got this locks menu here. So we don't want to lock move. We want to keep that, but we want to lock everything else. So let's lock rotate and scale, and then for this one we only want to rotate that, so let's lock move and scale, and for this one we only want to rotate this, so let's lock move and scale. So now if I select this one, if I select my move tool, I can't actually go in here and move that anymore. It doesn't let me. I can only rotate it. So now we're sort of making it easier for our animator to not break the rig. Another thing you can do as well is you can select this ball and you can pretty much do the same thing, or you can go, you can just right click on it and go freeze. So now it's frozen. So if I go out of wireframe again, see if I draw a selection around it, you can't actually select the ball. So now the animator can't actually break the rig. Unless they, go in and start doing weird things. Sometimes there's a tail, so sometimes we get a tail on this ball, and we can do that. So if I go to, let's say, just go to a side view for a second, so side view, and let's just add a tail. So if I go to create some bones, I'll snap this to the grid. So I'll go maybe click, 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 and we'll delete that little end bone. There we go. So now we've got a little tail. So if I go back to the perspective view, you can see we've got a tail here. We can move this down, like over here if we want. And then it's like, alright, cool. So maybe we could link this. So maybe we could link this tail up to, say, the rotation. So that when we rotate the ball, let's like this, to rotate the ball, the tail moves. That's great. But as soon as we go, alright, let's start to stretch it, the tail is not going to move anymore. So what we pretty much need to do is we need to tell, so we'll unlink for a second, we need to tell this tail that it belongs in this FFD deformation group, because we want the tail to sort of deform with the mesh. But there's also a problem. So if I was to add these bones to the FFD deformer, so if I go back to our FFD deformer. If I was to go, right, select all these bones, and then say, let's add these to the FFD Space Warp. Now if I was to go stretch, ooh, you can see they sort of go a bit weird. So we don't want that. So delete that, delete that, delete that. We pretty much want to keep these points positioned on the mesh, even if they scale and skew and rotate and all that. But we don't want to actually skew the bones themselves. We want to keep the bones how they are. So what we can do is we can create a reference point just as a guide. So I can go to point helper here, create just another point helper, and then I can actually attach this point to the mesh. So I can attach this point to the surface of the mesh. So if I just delete, if I just hide the bones for a second, and if I go to a little cool little thing over here called, where is it? Animation constraints, attachment constraints. So if I click on that, now I can click the ball. What it's going to do is it's going to attach this point to the ball mesh. There we go. So if I double click on the attachment constraint, now we get all our options here. So you can see here that it's attached to, it says it's attached to face 2, and it's positioned in the middle of the face. So what we can do is we can select the face, so we can type in a face that we want it to attach to. So we can just go through this, so we can scroll through, and it's just going to go through every single face until it finds the one we want it to be attached to. Or we can do set position. If I click on set position, now I can actually drag it around the mesh to pick a position we want it to be set to. So let's say we want it to be this one, this point here. So I'll drag it down to this face. It just has to be close. And now you can see here we get a visual representation. So this quad is actually 2 triangles. So we're in this middle of this triangle now. So you can see here it's a visual representation of where it is on that triangle. So we want it to be down here on this first point. So we can see as we start to get close to that point, it wants to go to 0 and 1. So I can just set 0 and 1, bang, and now it's going to be exactly on that point. So I click set position off, and you can see now as well is it's trying to align itself to this mesh as well. So we can actually go up to align to surface. We can tick that off, and now what's going to happen is if I rotate the mesh like this, see it's going to move with the surface of the mesh. It's not going to align with it yet, but it's going to move with it, and we can pretty much, any deformers we have on it, it's going to make that mesh move as well. So it's moving with the mesh regardless of what happens. So what we can do now is, because we want this to orient like the ball, we can just give this an orientation constraint. So we can say orientation constraint to our ball rotation controller, and now when we orientate our ball, it's going to move with it. And now what we can do is we can get our tail back, so we can get our tailbones here, and we can simply go, we can just put this, let's just align this to the point, not the rotation. And now what we can do is we can link this bone to our point, and now everything should work. So now what we can do is we should be able to rotate our ball, we should be able to scale, squash and stretch our ball like that, and our tail is going to stay sort of like conformed to our mesh like that. And now that we've done all this, we can pretty much say we can link this point to, say, the ball position, just like that, and now everything's going to work just as we need it. Actually, so we can hide this point too. So where's that? So that point here, actually we should rename that. So we'll call this point tail reference, and then we can hide that. And then now we've got our ball. So there we go. So now pretty much we've got our ball set up. One last thing you might want to do, just once you've got all this going, you might want to do some sort of global scale, so you can just scale the ball up. So easy enough to do. We can just go create point, and we can just pretty much zero that out to 0 there, and we can just call this. We can call this something like I don't know, ball scale, and then because everything else is linked to this ball position, we can pretty much just link this ball position to the ball scale, and now we should be able to scale the ball. Boom, boom, there we go. So we scaled the ball and everything like that, so now everything should just work exactly how we want. Now we can animate on just position. Then we can chuck in our rotation. And then with the squash and stretch, it's all squashy ball, there we go. Squash, squash, squash. That is the squishy ball. Oh yeah, squishy, squishy ball, squishy, squishy ball. I've gone fucking crazy again, yeah. Bow, bow, bow. There we go. Oh, my tea's gone cold. Uh-oh. Iced tea, motherfucker. Hopefully that helps a little bit. Thanks for watching. Whoop, whoop.